The smell of whiskey and shame clung to Ruby McKenna's dress as she stumbled out of the Silver Spur Saloon into the dusty streets of Redemption, Texas, where the scorching August sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly, and the town's most vicious gossips were already sharpening their tongues. Ruby was 22 years old, and she had been working as a saloon girl for 3 months now, ever since her father died and left her with nothing but debts and a tarnished name. The women of Redemption crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming, clutching their precious daughters close as if Ruby's poverty and profession were contagious diseases that could infect their pristine reputations. The men leered at her with hungry eyes but would never acknowledge her in the daylight, saving their greetings for the smoky interior of the saloon where morality came cheap and judgments were suspended for the price of a drink. She wiped the sweat from her brow and headed toward the general store, needing flour and coffee for the tiny room she rented above the seamstress shop. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, watched her approach through narrowed eyes, her mouth already pursing in disapproval. Ruby straightened her spine and lifted her chin, refusing to give these people the satisfaction of seeing her broken, even though inside she felt like shattered glass held together by sheer stubbornness and the will to survive another day. "We don't serve your kind here, Mrs. Henderson announced loudly as Ruby stepped through the door, her voice carrying to every corner of the store where other customers suddenly found the floor fascinating to study. "My money is the same color as everyone else's," Ruby replied quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest like hot coals. "Take your business elsewhere," Mrs. Henderson snapped, crossing her arms over her ample bosom. "This is a respectable establishment." Ruby's cheeks flamed red, but she turned on her heel and walked back into the street, blinking back tears that she absolutely refused to shed in public. She had endured worse than this. She had survived her mother's death when she was 12, her father's drinking that had consumed their small ranch piece by piece, and the terrible loneliness that came from being truly alone in a world that measured a woman's worth by her circumstances rather than her character. She was halfway down the street when she heard the deep voice behind her, rich as molasses and carrying an edge of steel that made people stop and listen. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm surprised at you." Ruby turned to see Jack Thornton emerging from the general store, and her breath caught in her throat the way it always did when she saw him. He was the kind of man that made women forget their own names, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of whiskey held up to lamplight. He owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, employed half the men in Redemption, and could trace his family back to some of the first settlers in Texas. He was also, according to every unmarried woman and their scheming mothers, the most eligible bachelor within 100 miles. "Mr. Thornton, I was just maintaining the standards of my establishment," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice suddenly sweet as honey. But Jack was already walking past her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each purposeful stride. He caught up to Ruby in 3 long steps, his hat shading his face from the brutal sun. "Miss McKenna," he said, tipping his hat with the kind of respect that gentlemen reserved for ladies, not saloon girls. "I believe you were attempting to make a purchase." "It's all right," Ruby said quickly, not wanting his pity or his charity. "I can go to the next town over." "That's a 20-mile ride in this heat," Jack replied, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "And there's no reason you should have to make it. Come on." He placed his hand on the small of her back, the touch light but somehow burning through the thin fabric of her dress, and guided her back toward the store. Ruby wanted to protest, wanted to tell him that his kindness would only make things worse for both of them, but the words stuck in her throat like burrs as they walked through the door together. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. "Mr. Thornton, surely you understand that I must think of my other customers." "What I understand," Jack said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made even the other shoppers look up nervously. "Is that Miss McKenna is a customer with money to spend, and you just turned away her business? Now, I'm going to stand right here while she makes her purchases, and you're going to serve her with the same courtesy you'd show anyone else. And if you don't, well, I might have to reconsider where I buy supplies for my ranch. That's about $300 a month you'd be losing if I calculated correctly." The silence in the store was so complete that Ruby could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and then she forced a smile so tight it looked painful. "Of course, Mr. Thornton. Miss McKenna, what can I get for you today?" Ruby's hands trembled as she gave her order, hyper-aware of Jack standing beside her like a guardian angel with a Winchester rifle and the power to reshape the social order of the entire town. She tried to pay quickly, fumbling with her coins, but Jack reached out and steadied her hand with his own, his fingers warm and calloused from years of ranch work. "Take your time," he murmured, and something in his voice made her look up into his eyes, where she saw not pity but something else entirely, something that made her stomach flip and her pulse race in a way that had nothing to do with fear or embarrassment. When her purchases were wrapped and paid for, Jack took the package from her despite her protests and walked with her out into the street. The townspeople were staring now, their faces a mixture of shock and scandalized delight at this unexpected entertainment. Ruby could practically hear their minds working, already composing the stories they would tell over dinner tables and in sewing circles about Jack Thornton and the saloon girl. "You shouldn't have done that," Ruby said when they were out of earshot of the store. "They'll talk about you now." "Let them talk," Jack replied, shifting her package to one arm. "Where are you staying?" "Above the seamstress shop, but really, you don't need to walk me there. You've already done more than enough, and I don't want to cause you any more trouble than I already have." Jack stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Miss McKenna, you didn't cause me any trouble. People like Mrs. Henderson cause trouble with their small minds and smaller hearts, and I'd like to walk you home if you'll let me." Ruby studied his face, searching for the ulterior motive she had learned to expect from men. But his eyes were clear and honest, and there was a gentleness in his expression that made something long frozen in her chest begin to thaw. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you." They walked in silence for a moment, the sun beating down relentlessly and the dust swirling around their feet. Ruby was intensely aware of the people watching them from windows and doorways, their disapproval hanging in the air like smoke. "I've seen you at the saloon," Jack said finally, his voice casual but his eyes fixed straight ahead. "You don't drink and you don't go upstairs with the men." Ruby felt her cheeks burn again, but this time with anger. "Is there a question in there somewhere, Mr. Thornton?" "It's just Jack," he said. "And no, not a question, just an observation. You're different from the other girls there." "Different doesn't mean better," Ruby replied bitterly. "Not in this town. Here, I'm just another fallen woman who isn't fit to breathe the same air as respectable folks." They had reached the seamstress shop, and Jack handed her the package, but he didn't step away. Instead, he leaned against the wall, his hat pushed back on his head, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What if I told you that I think this town has it backwards?" He said quietly. "What if I told you that I think you're too good for them, not the other way around?" Ruby's heart stuttered in her chest. "I'd say you were either drunk or delusional. I work in a saloon, Jack. I serve drinks to men who can barely stand up. I smile at people who wouldn't spit on me if I was on fire. That's not too good for anything." "You work to survive," Jack corrected. "You hold your head high when others would have crumbled. You have dignity in a situation designed to strip it away. That takes more strength than any of these so-called respectable people will ever know." Tears pricked at Ruby's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "Why are you being kind to me? What do you want?" "I want to take you to dinner," Jack said, and the words hung between them like a challenge. "Tomorrow night, somewhere nice." Somewhere public where everyone can see that I think you're worth my time and attention. That's insane, Ruby whispered. They'll crucify you. Your reputation will be ruined. My reputation can handle it, Jack said with a slight smile. Can yours handle being seen with me? That's not how this works, Ruby protested. You're Jack Thornton. You could have any woman in 3 counties. Why would you want to be seen with me? Jack pushed off from the wall and took a step closer, close enough that Ruby could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. Maybe because you're the only woman I've met who talks to me like I'm just a man instead of a bank account with a ranch attached. Maybe because I've been watching you for weeks, seeing how you handle the world's cruelty with grace. Or maybe I'm just tired of pretending that I don't think you're the most beautiful woman I've ever laid eyes on. Ruby's breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only stare at him with her heart hammering against her ribs. You don't know me, she finally managed. Then have dinner with me and let me get to know you, Jack said, unless you're afraid. I'm terrified, Ruby admitted. But not of you. I'm afraid of hoping for something I can't have. I'm afraid of believing that someone like you could really want someone like me and then having that hope ripped away. Jack reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her want to cry. I won't rip anything away from you, Ruby. I promise. Just give me a chance to prove that not everyone in this world is cruel. Ruby looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, rough and strong and steady. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the ways this could go wrong, all the pain that might be waiting at the end of this road. But she also thought about the loneliness that had been her constant companion and the tiny flicker of hope that Jack's words had ignited in her heart. Tomorrow night, she said, meeting his eyes. But I'm warning you now, this is going to cause you nothing but trouble. Jack's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Ruby McKenna, I have a feeling you're going to be the best kind of trouble I've ever found. The next day, the town of Redemption buzzed with gossip like a hive of angry bees. Ruby heard it everywhere she went, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she passed, knowing looks exchanged between the proper ladies of the town. Jack Thornton and the saloon girl. Jack Thornton throwing away his reputation for a woman of questionable virtue. Jack Thornton breaking his poor mother's heart by consorting with trash. That last one stung more than Ruby wanted to admit, because she had heard about Jack's mother, Catherine Thornton, a formidable woman who had helped build the Thornton Ranch from nothing and who held court over Redemption Society like a benevolent queen. The thought of disappointing her, of being the source of family strife, made Ruby's stomach churn with guilt. She was tempted to send Jack a message calling off their dinner, to save them both from the scandal that was already brewing. But every time she started to compose the words in her mind, she remembered the way he had looked at her, the sincerity in his voice when he said she was too good for this town, and she couldn't quite bring herself to do it. Instead, she spent the afternoon scrubbing herself clean in the wash basin in her tiny room, using the last of her lavender soap that she had been saving for special occasions. She washed her hair until it shone like polished mahogany and carefully pressed the only decent dress she owned, a simple blue cotton that had been her mother's and was slightly out of fashion but at least clean and modest. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Ruby heard boots on the stairs outside her door. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she took one last look at herself in the small, cracked mirror she owned, trying to see what Jack saw when he looked at her. All she saw was a tired young woman with shadows under her eyes and too much fear in her face. The knock was gentle but firm, and when Ruby opened the door, Jack stood there in a clean shirt and vest, his hat in his hands, looking at her like she was something precious and rare. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the way he said it made Ruby believe him. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Ruby replied, trying to keep her voice light despite the nervous energy coursing through her veins. Jack offered her his arm, and Ruby took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her fingers. They descended the stairs together and stepped out into the evening air, where the temperature had finally dropped to something bearable, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The restaurant Jack had chosen was the finest in Redemption, a place where ranchers and businessmen took their families for Sunday dinners and special celebrations. Ruby had never been inside, had only ever looked through the windows at the white tablecloths and gleaming silverware, and wished she was the kind of person who belonged in such a place. The moment they walked through the door, every conversation in the room stopped. Ruby felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, felt the judgment and the shock and the outrage rolling toward her like a physical force. Her steps faltered, and she almost turned and ran, but Jack's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, steadying her. "Just look at me," he murmured, his voice low and meant only for her ears. "Forget everyone else. They don't matter." The proprietor, a rotund man named Mr. Davies who Ruby recognized from the saloon where he often drank more than he should, approached them with a face like a thundercloud. "Mr. Thornton, I'm afraid we don't have any tables available this evening." "That's strange," Jack said mildly, gesturing to the half-empty dining room. "It looks like you have several." Mr. Davies's face reddened. "I meant we don't have any tables available for certain types of patrons." "I see," Jack said, and his voice had gone cold as January ice. "Well, Mr. Davies, I'm going to give you a choice. You can seat us at your best table right now, or I can walk out of here and make sure that every rancher and businessman I know understands exactly why. And considering I'm friends with most of them, and you depend on their business to keep this place running, I'd think carefully about your answer." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Mr. Davies looked like he might argue, but then he glanced around at the other diners, many of whom worked for Jack or did business with him, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Right this way, Mr. Thornton," he said through gritted teeth, leading them to a table by the window where everyone could see them. Jack pulled out Ruby's chair for her with the same courtesy he would show a duchess, and Ruby sat down, her hands shaking slightly as she placed them in her lap. Around them, conversations slowly resumed, but Ruby could feel the stares, could hear the whispered comments that weren't quite quiet enough. "That's the saloon girl," someone hissed. "Can you believe the nerve? Poor Jack Thornton, he must have taken leave of his senses." "I always knew there was something wrong with that Ruby McKenna. She's probably tricked him somehow." Jack reached across the table and took Ruby's hand, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a soothing gesture. "Talk to me," he said. "Tell me something about yourself that nobody else knows." Ruby looked up at him, surprised by the request. "Why?" "Because I want to know you, not what people say about you. I want to hear your voice and your thoughts and the things that make you who you are." Ruby swallowed hard, touched by his words in a way that made her chest ache. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said quietly. "Before my mother died, I was studying. I loved books and learning and the idea of helping children discover the world through education. But after she passed, my father needed help with the ranch and there was never time or money for school. And then he died too, and, well, you know the rest." "Do you still want to teach?" Jack asked, leaning forward, his attention focused entirely on her as if they were the only two people in the room. "I don't know," Ruby admitted. "It feels like a dream from a different life. A different Ruby who had possibilities and a future. This Ruby just tries to survive from one day to the next. What if you could have those possibilities again?" Jack asked. "What if the future didn't have to be just survival?" Before Ruby could answer, a woman's voice cut through the restaurant like a knife. "Jackson Thornton, what in heaven's name do you think you're doing?" Ruby looked up to see a tall, elegant woman bearing down on their table, her silver hair swept up in an elaborate style, and her silk dress rustling with each agitated step. Catherine Thornton had arrived, and she looked about as happy as a cat dropped in a water trough. Jack stood up immediately, his face a mixture of respect and resignation. "Mother, this is Ruby McKenna. Ruby, this is my mother, Catherine Thornton." Ruby stood as well, her legs unsteady, and performed a small curtsy that her own mother had taught her years ago. "Mrs. Thornton, it's an honor to meet you." Catherine's sharp blue eyes, so like her son's, swept over Ruby from head to toe, taking in every detail. "Miss McKenna, I've heard a great deal about you." "None of it good, I'm sure," Ruby replied, deciding that honesty was her only option here. A flicker of something, maybe surprise or respect, crossed Catherine's face. "Jack, might I speak with you privately for a moment? Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of Ruby," Jack replied firmly. Catherine's eyes narrowed. "Very well. Have you completely lost your mind? This girl works in a saloon. She's not suitable company for a man of your standing. The whole town is talking about this ridiculous spectacle you're making of yourself." "Let them talk," Jack said, echoing his words from the day before. "I don't care what they think." "Well, you should care," Catherine snapped. "You have responsibilities. You have a reputation to uphold. You cannot simply throw everything away for some infatuation with an unsuitable woman." Ruby felt each word like a slap, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet Catherine's eyes without flinching. "Mrs. Thornton, you're right. I do work in a saloon because it was the only job I could find after my father died and left me with nothing. I'm not educated or refined or suitable by your standards, but I'm not trying to trap your son or take advantage of him. I told him this was a bad idea from the start." "Then why are you here?" Catherine demanded. "Because he asked me," Ruby said simply. "And because for the first time in a very long time, someone treated me like I was worth something more than contempt and judgment." Catherine stared at her for a long moment, and Ruby stared back, refusing to back down even though her heart was racing and her palms were sweating. Finally, Catherine turned back to her son. "Jack, I'm asking you to think about what you're doing. Think about the future, about the ranch, about everything your father and I built for you." "I am thinking about the future, Mother," Jack said quietly. "And for the first time in years, I'm excited about it. Ruby is a good woman who's been dealt a hard hand. She deserves kindness and respect, not cruelty from people who judge her without knowing her. And I intend to get to know her, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it." Catherine looked between them, her face unreadable. Then she straightened her shoulders and gave a curt nod. "I see I won't change your mind tonight, but this conversation is far from over, Jackson." She swept out of the restaurant with the same dramatic flair she had entered with, leaving a wake of whispers behind her. Jack sat back down and gestured for Ruby to do the same. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "My mother can be formidable when she wants to be." "She loves you," Ruby said. "She's trying to protect you. I can't fault her for that. She'll come around," Jack said with more confidence than Ruby felt. "Once she gets to know you, she'll understand." Ruby wasn't sure about that, but she didn't argue. Instead, she tried to focus on the dinner that followed, on the surprisingly good food and the easy conversation that flowed between her and Jack, once the initial drama had passed. He told her about the ranch, about the challenges of managing so much land and so many cattle, about his dreams of expanding and improving the breeding stock. She told him about her childhood, about her mother's gentle wisdom and her father's decline, about the books she had loved and the life she had imagined for herself before reality intervened. By the time they finished eating, the restaurant had mostly cleared out, the other diners apparently having gotten their fill of scandal for one evening. Jack paid the bill despite Ruby's protests that she should contribute, and then they walked out into the cool night air. "Thank you for tonight," Ruby said as they strolled slowly back toward her room. "I know it wasn't easy, and I know it probably cost you more than you're letting on." "It was worth every second," Jack replied. "Ruby, I want to see you again, not just once, but as often as you'll let me. I know this is complicated, and I know people are going to make it hard on both of us. But I think there's something real between us, and I want to explore that, if you're willing." Ruby stopped walking and turned to face him, the moonlight casting silver shadows across his handsome face. "Jack, I need you to understand something. I'm not a good investment. I come with baggage and a bad reputation and no prospects. If you pursue this, you're going to lose friends. Your mother is going to be furious. The whole town is going to turn against you. And in the end, I might not be worth all that trouble." Jack reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle but sure. "Ruby McKenna, you let me worry about what you're worth. I'm a grown man who makes my own decisions, and I've decided that I want to know you, really know you. I want to spend time with you and talk with you and see where this leads. So the only question that matters is whether you want that too." Ruby's heart felt like it might burst out of her chest. Every instinct she had honed for survival told her to run, to protect herself from the inevitable pain that came from wanting things she couldn't have. But looking into Jack's eyes, seeing the sincerity and warmth there, she found herself nodding. "Yes," she whispered. "I want that too. God help me, but I do." Jack's smile was brilliant, and then he leaned down and kissed her forehead, a chaste gesture that somehow felt more intimate than anything Ruby had ever experienced. "Then we'll figure out the rest together," he murmured against her skin. The weeks that followed were both the happiest and most difficult of Ruby's life. Jack came to see her every day, sometimes taking her riding out on the range where they could escape the judgmental eyes of the town, sometimes simply sitting with her on the steps of the seamstress shop and talking for hours. He was courting her in the old-fashioned sense of the word, treating her with a respect and tenderness that Ruby had never experienced from any man. But the town's reaction was brutal. The gossips worked overtime, spinning tales about Ruby that grew more outlandish with each retelling. She was a gold digger, a witch who had cast a spell on poor Jack Thornton, a scheming harlot who was probably carrying another man's child and trying to trap the richest man in the county. The women of Redemption shunned her even more completely than before, and the men at the saloon became bolder in their propositions, apparently believing that if she was good enough for Jack Thornton, she should be available to anyone. Ruby endured it all with as much grace as she could muster, but there were nights when she cried herself to sleep, wondering if loving Jack was worth the price they were both paying. She saw how people treated him differently now, how former friends crossed the street to avoid him, how business associates suddenly had concerns about their dealings with the Thornton Ranch. One particularly difficult evening, about a month into their courtship, Ruby was walking back from the market when she encountered a group of women led by Millicent Hartwell, the mayor's wife and the unofficial queen of Redemption Society. They blocked her path on the boardwalk, their faces arranged in expressions of righteous superiority. "Miss McKenna," Millicent said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we've been discussing your situation, and we feel it's our Christian duty to speak with you." Ruby's stomach nodded, but she kept her expression neutral. "What situation would that be, Mrs. Hartwell?" "Your pursuit of Jack Thornton, of course," Millicent replied. "Really, dear, we understand that a girl in your position might be desperate to improve her circumstances, but you must see that this infatuation of his cannot last. A man of his breeding and education will eventually come to his senses and realize what a mistake he's making. When that happens, you'll be left with nothing but a more tarnished reputation than you already have." "I'm not pursuing Jack," Ruby said quietly, her hands clenched at her sides. "He's pursuing me." "But I suppose that's difficult for you to understand, that a man might genuinely care for someone based on who they are rather than their social standing." Millicent's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Don't you dare take that tone with me, you little strumpet. You are a blight on this town, a bad influence on impressionable young women, and a disgrace to decent people everywhere. If you had any shame or decency, you would remove yourself from Jack's life and let him find a suitable match. And who would you suggest?" Ruby asked, an edge creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Your daughter, perhaps? I've seen the way Emily Hartwell looks at Jack like he's a prize bull at the county fair. Is that what this is really about, Mrs. Hartwell? Jealousy that he chose me over your precious daughter?" The slap came so fast that Ruby didn't have time to dodge it. Pain exploded across her cheek, and she staggered back, her hand flying to her face. The other women gasped, some in shock, some in what sounded suspiciously like satisfaction. "How dare you?" Millicent hissed. "You are nothing, you come from nothing, you will always be nothing, and Jack Thornton will realize that soon enough." Ruby's eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She drew herself up to her full height and looked Millicent straight in the eye. "You know what I've learned, Mrs. Hartwell. Nothing shows a person's true character quite like how they treat those they consider beneath them. And right now, you're showing me exactly who you are. I may work in a saloon, but at least I've never struck another human being in anger. At least I don't derive pleasure from cruelty. So yes, maybe I am nothing by your standards, but your standards are worth less than dirt to me." She pushed past the stunned women and walked away, her head held high even though her cheek throbbed and her heart ached. She made it to the alley behind the general store before the tears finally came, hot and bitter, spilling down her face as she leaned against the rough wood wall and tried to catch her breath. "Ruby." She looked up to find Jack standing at the entrance to the alley, his face dark with concern. He must have seen the confrontation, or at least the aftermath, because he was at her side in an instant, his hands gentle as he tilted her face toward the fading sunlight to examine her injured cheek. "Who did this to you?" he demanded, and there was a dangerous edge to his voice that Ruby had never heard before. "It doesn't matter," Ruby said, trying to turn away, but Jack held her firmly. "It matters to me. Who did this? Mrs. Hartwell, but Jack, please don't make this worse. It's already so hard, and if you confront her, it will just give them more ammunition to use against us." Jack's jaw clenched so hard Ruby could see the muscle jumping. "She struck you. That's assault, Ruby. She can't just go around hitting people because she doesn't like them." "She can when the person is me," Ruby said wearily. "I'm a saloon girl, Jack. I have no standing in this community. If you try to defend me, you'll just drag yourself down further, and I can't. I won't be responsible for destroying everything you've built." "Everything I've built," Jack repeated, his voice rising. "Ruby, none of that matters if I can't protect the woman I'm falling in love with. None of it means anything if I have to stand by and watch people hurt you." Ruby's breath caught at his words, her heart seeming to stop and then start again at double speed. "You're falling in love with me," Jack's expression softened, and he cupped her uninjured cheek with his hand. "Of course I am. I thought that was obvious. I've been falling for you since that first day at the general store, maybe even before that. I love your strength and your dignity and the way you refuse to let this town break you. I love how you light up when you talk about books and how you treat everyone with kindness even when they don't deserve it. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you challenge me to be better. So yes, Ruby McKenna, I'm falling in love with you. Actually, scratch that. I've already fallen. I'm completely, hopelessly in love with you." Ruby's tears flowed freely now, but they were different tears, tears of joy and disbelief and overwhelming emotion. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I can't help it. I love you, Jack Thornton." Jack's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, and then he was kissing her, really kissing her, his lips warm and firm against hers. Ruby melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and emotion she had been holding inside. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had ever imagined and more, sweet and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it's fast and I know it's going to cause an uproar, but I don't care. Marry me, Ruby. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you how much you're worth." Ruby's heart soared, but reality crashed back down just as quickly. "Jack, think about what you're saying. Your mother will never accept this. The town will never accept this. You'll lose everything." "I'll gain everything that matters," Jack countered. "Ruby, I don't want a life where I have to pretend to care about the opinions of people like Millicent Hartwell. I don't want to spend my days courting some vapid society girl who only wants me for my money and my name. I want you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to build a life with you, a real life based on love and respect and partnership. Please say yes." Ruby looked into his eyes and saw her future there, saw the possibility of happiness she had thought was lost to her forever. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the practical concerns and social consequences. But then she thought about how empty her life had been before Jack, how gray and colorless her days had seemed. And she thought about how he made her feel cherished and valued and loved for exactly who she was. "Yes," she said, and the word came out as a laugh and a sob all at once. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jack whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around in the alley as Ruby clung to him and laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he set her down, he kissed her again, and Ruby thought that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Maybe love really was strong enough to overcome prejudice and social barriers. Maybe their story could have a happy ending after all, but the universe, it seemed, wasn't quite done testing them yet. The news of their engagement spread through Redemption like wildfire, and the reaction was immediate and explosive. Catherine Thornton arrived at the ranch house the next morning, her face pale with fury, and proceeded to have what Jack later described as a legendary fit. She threatened to disown him, to cut him off from the family fortune, to leave the ranch to a distant cousin rather than see it go to Ruby McKenna. Jack listened to all of this with patient calm, and then said simply, "That's your choice to make, Mother. But my choice is Ruby, and nothing you say will change that." The mayor came to call that afternoon, accompanied by several prominent businessmen, to express their concerns about Jack's judgment and suitability to serve on various civic boards. Jack resigned from all of them on the spot. Millicent Hartwell spread a rumor that Ruby was pregnant and trying to trap Jack into marriage, despite the fact that they had never been inappropriate with each other. Other women whispered that Ruby must be using some kind of dark magic or feminine wiles to control him. Through it all, Jack remained steadfast, making plans for a small wedding and looking into legal matters to ensure that Ruby would be protected and provided for. But Ruby could see the toll it was taking on him, the way his shoulders grew a little more tense with each confrontation, the worry lines that appeared around his eyes. 3 days before the planned wedding, Ruby made a decision. She waited until Jack had left for the day to handle ranch business, and then she sat down and wrote him a letter. Her hand shook as she formed the words, tears blotting the ink in places, but she forced herself to continue. "My dearest Jack," she wrote, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please don't try to find me. This is not what I want, but it is what must be. I cannot stand by and watch you lose everything you've worked for, everything your family built because of me. You deserve a life free from scandal and judgment. You deserve a wife who brings honor to your name, not shame. I will love you for the rest of my days, but I love you too much to let you destroy yourself for my sake. Please find happiness with someone worthy of you. You will always have my heart. Ruby." She packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag, put on her traveling dress, and walked to the stagecoach station. She had enough money saved for a ticket to El Paso, where she could disappear into a bigger city and start over. Maybe she could finally pursue that dream of teaching, or find some other respectable work. Maybe, in time, the pain in her chest would ease, and she would be able to breathe without feeling like she was suffocating. She was standing at the ticket window, handing over her money, when she heard boots thundering on the wooden platform behind her. "Ruby McKenna, don't you dare get on that stage." She turned to find Jack striding toward her, her letter clutched in his hand, his face a mixture of panic and determination. Behind him, breathing hard and looking surprisingly sympathetic, was Catherine Thornton. "Jack, please," Ruby said, her voice breaking. "Let me go, it's for the best." "The hell it is," Jack said, reaching her side and taking her arm. "Do you really think I'm going to let you walk out of my life because of what a bunch of narrow-minded gossips think?" "It's not just gossips," Ruby protested. "It's your mother, your business associates, the whole structure of your life. I'm tearing it all apart, Jack. Can't you see that?" "No," Jack said firmly. They're tearing it apart with their prejudice and their judgment. You're the only thing holding me together." Catherine stepped forward then, and Ruby braced herself for another confrontation. But to her surprise, the older woman's face was softer than Ruby had ever seen it. "Miss McKenna," Catherine said quietly, "might I speak with you for a moment?" Ruby glanced at Jack, who looked as surprised as she felt, but he nodded. Catherine gestured to a bench at the edge of the platform, and Ruby followed her there, sitting down with her carpetbag clutched in her lap like a shield. Catherine was silent for a long moment, staring out at the dusty street. Then she began to speak. "When I was 19 years old, I fell in love with a cowboy named Thomas Thornton. He was everything my family despised: poor, uneducated, rough around the edges. My father forbade me to see him. My mother wept and said I was throwing my life away. All of society told me I was making a terrible mistake." She turned to look at Ruby then, and her eyes were sad but warm. "I married him anyway, and it was the best decision I ever made. We built that ranch from nothing, working side by side through droughts and hard winters and every challenge the land could throw at us. He died 5 years ago, and not a day goes by that I don't miss him." Ruby stared at her, speechless. "I look at my son," Catherine continued, "and I see the same fire in his eyes that Thomas had, the same stubborn determination, the same absolute certainty in his choice. And I look at you, and I see a young woman who's been dealt a hard hand but hasn't let it break her, who has dignity and strength and the courage to walk away from the man she loves because she thinks it's what's best for him. That takes real character, Miss McKenna." "Mrs. Thornton," Ruby began, but Catherine held up a hand. "Let me finish. I've been cruel to you, and I apologize for that. I was scared. Scared that my son was going to get hurt, scared that you were like so many others who only see the Thornton name and money. But I've watched you these past weeks. I've seen how you've endured the town's hatred with grace. I've seen how you look at Jack like he's your whole world. And I've seen how ready you are to sacrifice your own happiness for his well-being. That's love, real love, and it's rare and precious." Tears were streaming down Ruby's face now. "I do love him, more than anything, but I don't want to be the reason his life falls apart." "Then don't run away," Catherine said gently. "Stay and fight. Fight for him, fight for your love, fight to show this town that they're wrong about you. Let me help you. Let me stand beside you and Jack and show redemption that the Thornton family stands by its own. Because if Jack marries you, you'll be my daughter, and I protect my family fiercely." Ruby couldn't speak through her tears, so she simply threw her arms around Catherine, hugging her tightly. Catherine stiffened for just a moment, then relaxed and hugged her back, patting her shoulder soothingly. When they broke apart, both women were crying, and Jack was standing nearby with the most relieved expression Ruby had ever seen on his face. "Does this mean you're not getting on that stage?" he asked hopefully. Ruby stood up and walked to him, leaving her carpetbag forgotten on the bench. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I'm staying right here with you for as long as you'll have me." "That's going to be a very long time," Jack said, pulling her into his arms. "Like forever, for instance." Catherine approached them, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Well, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. No more small, quiet wedding. We're going to have a proper ceremony at the ranch with everyone in 3 counties invited. We're going to show this town that the Thorntons don't hide in shame, and we're certainly not ashamed of Ruby." "Mother, you don't have to do that," Jack protested, but Catherine waved him off. "Nonsense. I've already let too much time pass being difficult. Now I'm going to make up for it. Ruby, dear, you and I have a wedding to plan, and we only have 3 days to do it, so we'd better get started." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to her word, Catherine threw herself into wedding preparations with a determination that left everyone around her slightly dazed. She visited every prominent family in Redemption personally, making it clear that the Thorntons expected them to attend the wedding and that any slight to Ruby would be considered a slight to the entire family. It was a masterstroke of social maneuvering. Most people were too intimidated by Catherine to refuse, and those who did suddenly found themselves on the outside of redemption society. The Thornton family was too wealthy, too influential, too important to snub. If Catherine said Ruby was acceptable, then Ruby became acceptable, at least on the surface. Ruby spent those 3 days in a daze, being fitted for a beautiful white dress that Catherine commissioned from the best seamstress in the county, learning about the ranch house that would be her new home, and receiving a stream of visitors who came to pay their respects. Some were genuine in their well wishes, others were clearly there out of obligation or curiosity. Ruby treated them all with grace, determined to prove Catherine's faith in her right. Millicent Hartwell came on the second day, her face stiff with forced politeness. "Miss McKenna," she said, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior the other day. It was unbecoming of me." Ruby looked at her steadily, seeing the calculation behind the apology. Millicent wasn't sorry. She was protecting her own social position. But Ruby had learned that sometimes grace meant accepting apologies that weren't truly meant. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell," Ruby said simply. "I appreciate you coming." Millicent's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she had expected more resistance, but she simply nodded and left. The night before the wedding, Catherine came to Ruby's room at the ranch house where Ruby was now staying in preparation for the ceremony. She carried a wooden box, worn with age, and sat down on the edge of the bed. "This was my mother's," Catherine said, opening the box to reveal a delicate pearl necklace. "She gave it to me on my wedding day, even though she disapproved of my choice. She said that every bride deserves to wear something beautiful, regardless of the circumstances. I wore it when I married Thomas, and I want you to wear it tomorrow." Ruby touched the pearls with trembling fingers. "Catherine, I can't, it's too precious." "Your family now," Catherine said firmly, "and family shares their treasures. Besides, I have no daughters, only Jack." "Who else am I going to give it to?" Ruby hugged her soon-to-be mother-in-law, overwhelmed by the generosity and acceptance she was being shown. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for giving me a chance, for standing up for me, for welcoming me into your family." "Thank you for loving my son," Catherine replied, "and for being brave enough to stay and fight for that love." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the late September air finally carrying a hint of coolness after the brutal Texas summer. The ranch had been transformed, with flowers and ribbons decorating every surface and rows of chairs set up in the garden where the ceremony would take place. Ruby dressed carefully, her hands shaking as she buttoned the beautiful white dress and fastened Catherine's pearls around her neck. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, so different from the frightened saloon girl of just a few months ago. There was a knock on the door and Catherine entered, her own dress a lovely dove gray. "You look beautiful," she said softly. "Jack is going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." "I'm nervous," Ruby admitted. "What if I make a mistake? What if I embarrass him?" "You won't," Catherine said firmly. "But even if you did, it wouldn't matter. Marriage isn't about perfection, Ruby. It's about partnership and forgiveness and choosing to love someone even on the days when it's hard. You and Jack have that. I can see it every time you look at each other." Music drifted up from the garden and Catherine offered Ruby her arm. "Ready?" Ruby took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." They descended the stairs together, and then Ruby was walking through the garden on Catherine's arm, seeing the faces of hundreds of people turning to watch her. Some looked curious, some skeptical, some genuinely happy. But Ruby only had eyes for Jack, standing at the end of the aisle in a dark suit, his face transformed by the most beautiful smile she had ever seen. Catherine placed Ruby's hand in Jack's and stepped back, and the minister began the ceremony. Ruby barely heard the words, too focused on Jack, on the way he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. When it came time for the vows, Jack spoke in a strong, clear voice that carried across the garden. "I, Jackson Thornton, take you, Ruby McKenna, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to stand beside you against anyone who would judge or harm you. I promise to build a life with you that's based on respect and partnership and true love. You are my heart, Ruby, and I will spend every day proving that you deserve all the happiness in the world." Ruby's voice shook as she spoke her own vows, but she meant every word. "I, Ruby McKenna, take you, Jackson Thornton, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you with everything I have, to support your dreams, to be your partner in all things. I promise to be worthy of the faith you've shown in me, to live my life in a way that honors the gift of your love. You saw me when I was invisible, valued me when I felt worthless, and loved me when I thought I was unlovable. I will treasure that for the rest of my days." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Jack kissed her with a tenderness that made Ruby's heart swell. Applause rang out across the garden, and Ruby realized that she was crying, but they were tears of pure joy. The reception that followed was a grand affair, with food and music and dancing that lasted until the stars came out. Ruby danced with Jack, with Catherine, with ranch hands who had worked for the Thorntons for decades, and welcomed her warmly into the family. She saw Millicent Hartwell and her daughter sitting stiffly at a corner table, their faces sour, and felt only pity for them. They would never understand the kind of love she and Jack shared, the kind of connection that transcended social boundaries and petty judgments. As the evening wore on and guests began to drift away, Jack took Ruby's hand and led her away from the party, up to the house and to the bedroom they would share as husband and wife. He closed the door behind them and pulled her into his arms, his hands gentle as they unpinned her hair and let it fall around her shoulders. "I love you, Mrs. Thornton," he murmured against her ear. "I love you too," Ruby replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Thank you for fighting for us. Thank you for never giving up." "Ruby, you're worth fighting for," Jack said, cupping her face in his hands. "You're worth everything." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Ruby kissed him back with all the love and passion she had been holding back. They tumbled onto the bed together, learning each other's bodies with tenderness and growing passion, coming together as husband and wife in the most intimate way. It was Ruby's first time, and Jack was patient and gentle, making sure she felt cherished and safe. When they finally joined together completely, Ruby felt a sense of rightness of coming home that brought fresh tears to her eyes. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the covers, Jack's arms around her as Ruby rested her head on his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" Jack asked softly, his fingers trailing through her hair. "I didn't know it was possible to be this happy," Ruby admitted. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find out this was all a dream." "It's real," Jack promised. "We're real. And we're going to have an amazing life together, Ruby. I promise you that." The first year of their marriage was an adjustment for both of them. Ruby had to learn how to run a large household, how to manage servants and plan meals, and handle the social obligations that came with being Mrs. Jack Thornton. Catherine was patient and helpful, teaching Ruby everything she needed to know and defending her fiercely whenever anyone dared to question her suitability. The town slowly came around, or at least learned to hide their disapproval behind polite faces. There were still whispers, still moments when Ruby felt the weight of judgment, but Jack's unwavering support and Catherine's social influence made it possible to navigate the challenges. Ruby threw herself into making a positive difference in redemption. She started a small school for children whose families couldn't afford to send them to the established academy, teaching reading and mathematics in a room at the back of the church. She organized charity drives for families in need and worked with Catherine to improve conditions for the ranch workers. Slowly but surely, Ruby earned the respect of the community through her actions rather than her background. People began to see her not as the former saloon girl who had trapped Jack Thornton, but as a kind, capable woman who genuinely cared about making the world better. Jack expanded the ranch operations, and he and Ruby worked as true partners, with Ruby managing the business accounts and correspondence while Jack handled the day-to-day operations. They were a formidable team, and the ranch prospered under their combined leadership. 2 years after their wedding, Ruby discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had heard too many stories of women who died in childbirth, seen too many children left motherless. But Jack was ecstatic, and Catherine immediately took charge, making sure Ruby had the best care available. The pregnancy was difficult, with Ruby suffering from severe sickness in the early months and exhaustion throughout. There were moments when she wondered if her body was strong enough for this, if she would survive to meet her child. But Jack was there every step of the way, holding her when she was sick, rubbing her swollen feet, talking to her belly and telling their unborn baby how much it was already loved. In the spring of 1881, after 20 hours of hard labor, Ruby gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after Jack's father, and the moment Ruby held her son for the first time, she understood a love so fierce and overwhelming that it took her breath away. Catherine cried when she held her grandson, calling him perfect and already seeing his grandfather in his features. The town celebrated the birth with gifts and well wishes, and Ruby realized that somewhere along the way she had truly been accepted. She wasn't the former saloon girl anymore. She was Ruby Thornton, wife and mother and respected member of the community. Jack was a devoted father, spending hours with Thomas even when the baby did nothing but sleep and eat. Ruby would find him in the nursery late at night, holding his son and singing soft lullabies that his own father had once sung to him. Watching them together, Ruby felt her heart expand with more love than she had thought possible. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic toddler with his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. 2 years later, Ruby gave birth again, this time to twin girls they named Sarah and Elizabeth. The household was chaotic and loud and absolutely perfect. Catherine reveled in her role as grandmother, spoiling the children shamelessly and teaching them stories about their grandfather and the early days of the ranch. She and Ruby had become truly close, more like mother and daughter than in-laws, and Ruby treasured their relationship. The years passed in a blur of happiness. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Ruby's school expanded to serve more students. She never forgot where she had come from, the poverty and shame that had once defined her life, and she made sure to help other women in difficult circumstances whenever she could. She started a program to provide job training for women who needed to support themselves, teaching skills like bookkeeping and sewing that could lead to respectable employment. She fought against the stigma that kept women like her former self trapped in cycles of poverty and judgment. And she used her position as Jack Thornton's wife to advocate for those who had no voice. Millicent Hartwell and others of her ilk never truly warmed to Ruby, but they learned to treat her with outward respect. Emily Hartwell eventually married a banker from Austin and moved away, and Ruby heard she was happy, which pleased her. She had never wanted to be anyone's enemy, only to be allowed to live her life in peace. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised Ruby with a trip to San Antonio, arranging for Catherine to watch the children so they could have a few days alone together. They stayed in a beautiful hotel and spent their days exploring the city and their nights rediscovering each other. One evening, as they walked along the river, Jack pulled Ruby close and kissed her forehead. "Do you remember that day in the alley when I told you I was falling in love with you? How could I forget?" Ruby replied, leaning into his warmth. "I thought you were crazy." "I was crazy," Jack admitted with a laugh. "Crazy in love with a beautiful, strong, amazing woman who I didn't deserve but somehow got lucky enough to marry. These 10 years with you have been the best of my life, Ruby. You've made me happier than I ever thought possible." "You saved me," Ruby said softly. "Not just from poverty or hardship, but from believing that I wasn't worth saving. You saw value in me when no one else did, including myself. You gave me a life I never dreamed I could have." "You saved yourself," Jack corrected gently. I just had the good sense to recognize how special you were. Everything you've accomplished, everything you've become, that's all you, Ruby. I'm just grateful I get to be by your side for the journey." They stood there on the riverbank, wrapped in each other's arms, and Ruby thought about how far they had come. From that first day at the general store to this moment, from scandal and judgment to respect and love, they had built something beautiful together. The gossips had said she wasn't good enough for him. Jack had said she was too good for them. In the end, they had both been wrong because they were simply good for each other, two imperfect people who had found perfect love in an imperfect world. The years continued to unfold with a gentle rhythm that Ruby had learned to treasure. Thomas grew tall and serious, with his father's sense of responsibility and his mother's compassion for others. He showed an early aptitude for ranching, and would often ride out with Jack to check on the cattle and learn the business that would one day be his. Sarah was the wild one, always climbing trees and racing horses, and giving Ruby heart palpitations with her fearlessness. She had Jack's smile and used it to charm her way out of trouble on a regular basis. Elizabeth was quieter, more contemplative, with a love of books that reminded Ruby of herself at that age. She would spend hours in the ranch library, devouring every volume she could find. In 1889, when Ruby was 33, she gave birth to one more child, another boy they named James. He came as a surprise, a late blessing that completed their family. Catherine, now in her 60s but still sharp and energetic, declared him her favorite grandchild, though everyone knew she said that about whichever child she was currently holding. Ruby's school had grown significantly, now occupying its own building that Jack had built with ranch funds. She employed 3 other teachers and served over 50 students, many from families who had once looked down on her. It gave Ruby deep satisfaction to know that she was making a real difference in these children's lives, giving them opportunities that she had almost lost. The town of Redemption had changed as well. The wild frontier days were fading, replaced by a more settled civilization. The railroad had come through in 1885, bringing new commerce and new people. The old prejudices were slowly eroding, replaced by a society that valued accomplishment more than background. Ruby sometimes thought about the girl she had been, standing outside that general store with shame burning in her cheeks, and marveled at how different her life had become. She was respected now, sought out for her advice and her friendship. She served on the church committee and organized the annual summer fair. She was Mrs. Jack Thornton, pillar of the community, and no one mentioned the saloon anymore except as ancient history, but Ruby never forgot. She made sure her children knew her story, the whole story, because she wanted them to understand that people deserve to be judged by their character, not their circumstances. She wanted them to extend kindness to those the world deemed unworthy, to see the humanity in everyone. Catherine lived to see all her grandchildren grow into young adults, passing away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 71 in 1895. Her death hit the family hard, but there was comfort in knowing she had lived a full, rich life and died surrounded by the love she had worked so hard to build. At the funeral, Ruby spoke about how Catherine had given her a second chance, how she had moved past her prejudices to embrace Ruby as a daughter. "She taught me that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose love over fear," Ruby told the assembled mourners. "She was a remarkable woman, and I will be forever grateful that she became my mother in all the ways that mattered." Thomas took over more of the ranch operations as Jack entered his 50s, proving himself to be a capable and innovative manager. He married a sweet young woman named Anna, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and they gave Jack and Ruby their first grandchild in 1898. Holding that baby, a little girl named Catherine in honor of her great-grandmother, Ruby felt the circle of life completing itself. She was a grandmother now, had lived long enough to see her own children become parents. It was a blessing she had never expected to receive, back in those dark days when she thought her life would never amount to anything. Sarah, true to her wild nature, shocked the family by announcing she wanted to become a veterinarian, one of the first women in Texas to pursue such a career. Jack supported her completely, funding her education and proudly telling anyone who would listen about his brilliant daughter. She eventually opened a practice in Redemption, treating ranch animals and beloved pets with equal care. Elizabeth became a teacher at Ruby's school, taking over as headmistress when Ruby decided to step back and focus more on her growing brood of grandchildren. She had inherited Ruby's gift for connecting with students and making learning exciting. James, the baby of the family, grew up with a love of horses and an easy charm that reminded everyone of Jack. He took over training and breeding operations at the ranch, developing a reputation for producing some of the finest quarter horses in Texas. As the new century dawned, Ruby and Jack found themselves with more time together, their children grown and starting families of their own. They took long rides across the ranch land, just the two of them, talking about everything and nothing. They traveled some, visiting places they had always wanted to see. But mostly, they simply enjoyed being together, the comfortable companionship of a marriage that had lasted through challenges and triumphs. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the family threw a huge celebration at the ranch. It seemed like half of Texas showed up, testament to the respect and affection that Ruby and Jack had earned over the years. Ruby wore a beautiful silver dress, and Jack gave a speech that made her cry. 25 years ago, he said, standing before the assembled crowd with Ruby's hand in his, I fell in love with a woman that society said wasn't good enough for me. The gossips said she would ruin my life, destroy my reputation, bring shame to my family. They were wrong about everything except one thing. She did change my life, but for the better in every possible way. Ruby Thornton is the strongest, kindest, most remarkable person I've ever known. She's been my partner, my best friend, my greatest love. And if I had to do it all over again, knowing every challenge we'd face, I wouldn't change a single thing because every moment with her has been worth it. The crowd applauded, many dabbing at their eyes, and Ruby stood to wrap her arms around her husband. I love you, she whispered in his ear. Then, now, and always. Always, Jack agreed, kissing her softly. As the party continued around them, Ruby looked at the faces of her children and grandchildren, at the friends and neighbors who had come to celebrate with them. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the hardships and the heartbreaks, the love and the triumphs. The girl who had once believed she was worth nothing had built a life of incredible worth. The woman they had called a fallen woman had risen to heights she never imagined. And the love story that everyone said was doomed had endured and flourished beyond all expectations. Years continued to pass with a gentle grace. Ruby and Jack grew older together, their hair turning silver, their faces gaining the lines that came from a lifetime of laughter and love. They were grandparents many times over now, with Thomas and Anna having 3 children, Sarah adopting 2 after finding she couldn't have her own, Elizabeth having 4, and James welcoming twins. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, and the family legacy was secure. Ruby's school had become an institution in Redemption, known throughout Texas for its quality education and inclusive policies. The little saloon where Ruby had once worked had been torn down years ago, replaced by a bank, and sometimes Ruby would walk past and marvel at how completely the landscape had changed. In the summer of 1908, on a warm evening with fireflies dancing in the garden, Ruby and Jack sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. They were in their 60s now, still healthy and active but moving a bit slower, treasuring the quiet moments. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Ruby asked, her hand in Jack's, their fingers intertwined as they had been countless times over the past 30 years. Sometimes, Jack admitted. If I had listened to the gossips, if I had let fear or concern for my reputation keep me from pursuing you, I would have missed out on the greatest joy of my life, I would have been safe and respectable and utterly miserable. I almost got on that stage, Ruby said softly, remembering that day at the station so many years ago. I almost left you. But you didn't, Jack said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. You stayed and we fought for our love and we built something beautiful. That's what matters, Ruby. Not the struggles, but how we overcame them together. Ruby leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him that had become as familiar as her own. I used to think that happy endings were just for fairy tales, that people like me didn't get them. But I was wrong. We got our happy ending, didn't we? This isn't the ending, Jack said with a smile in his voice. This is just another chapter in a very long and very happy story. We have years ahead of us still, years of watching our grandchildren grow, of enjoying the life we built, of loving each other. He was right, of course. They had many more years together, years filled with the kind of contentment that came from a life well lived. They celebrated more anniversaries, welcomed more grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. They continued to be active in their community, respected elders whose advice was sought and valued. Ruby never took any of it for granted. She remembered too well what it felt like to be scorned and rejected, to feel worthless and alone. Every morning when she woke up next to Jack, every evening when they sat together watching the sunset, every family gathering where she was surrounded by the people she loved most, she gave thanks for the incredible gift she had been given. The town gossips had been wrong about her. They had judged her by her circumstances rather than her character, had written her off as unworthy and unsuitable. But Jack had seen deeper, had recognized her true value when she couldn't see it herself. He had fought for her when she wanted to run, believed in her when she doubted herself, and loved her with a steadiness that never wavered. Together, they had proven that love could overcome social barriers, that character mattered more than status, and that sometimes the most unlikely love stories turned out to be the most enduring. They had built a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection, on partnership and trust, and the kind of deep connection that only grew stronger with time. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by 4 generations of family, Ruby looked at Jack and saw the same love in his eyes that had been there on their wedding day. They were older now, their bodies bearing the marks of age, but their love was as young and vital as ever. 40 years, Jack said, shaking his head in wonder. It feels like yesterday and forever ago all at once. 40 of the best years of my life, Ruby replied. Thank you for seeing me, Jack, for really seeing me when everyone else looked away. For believing I was worthy of love when I didn't believe it myself. You were always worthy, Jack said firmly. You were always too good for them, Ruby. I just helped you see it. As the sun set on that special day, casting golden light across the ranch that had been their home for 4 decades, Ruby McKenna Thornton reflected on the incredible journey of her life. She had gone from poverty to prosperity, from shame to respect, from loneliness to a love so deep and rich it still took her breath away. The gossips had been silenced by time and truth. The people who had said she wasn't good enough had been proven wrong in every possible way. And the cowboy who had defended her, who had said she was too good for them, had spent 40 years proving his faith in her was justified. In the end, their love story wasn't about overcoming scandal or defying society, though they had done both. It was about 2 people who recognized something precious in each other and refused to let the world's judgment destroy it. It was about choosing love over fear, faith over doubt, and each other over the opinions of those who didn't matter. Ruby and Jack lived many more years, their love story becoming the stuff of legend in redemption. They were the couple who had defied all odds, who had proven that true love could overcome any obstacle. They were proof that people could change and grow, that prejudices could be overcome, and that happy endings were possible even for those who started with nothing. When Ruby finally passed away peacefully at the age of 74, with Jack holding her hand and their children and grandchildren surrounding the bed, her last words were simple. What a beautiful life we had." Jack followed her less than 6 months later, unable to bear being without the woman who had been his heart for nearly 50 years. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky as wide and blue as the dreams they had dared to dream together. Their children made sure that their story was remembered, telling it to grandchildren and great-grandchildren as an example of the power of love and the importance of looking past surface judgments to see the true worth of a person. Ruby's school continued to operate, eventually being named the Ruby Thornton Academy in her honor. The ranch prospered for generations, staying in the family and standing as a testament to what could be built when two people worked together with love and determination. The town of Redemption changed with the times, eventually becoming a small city, but the story of Jack and Ruby Thornton remained a cherished part of its history. In later years, when people would ask about the beautiful cemetery on the hill overlooking the old Thornton Ranch, they would be told the story of the saloon girl and the cowboy who fell in love despite the whole town saying it was impossible. They would be told how the gossips said she wasn't good enough for him, but the cowboy said she was too good for them. They would be told about the courage it took to fight for love in the face of overwhelming opposition and the beautiful life that resulted from that courage. And sometimes, on warm summer evenings when the fireflies danced and the wind whispered through the grass, people swore they could feel the presence of Jack and Ruby on that hill, still together, still in love, still proving that the best love stories are the ones that people said could never happen. Their legacy lived on not just in their descendants or their material accomplishments, but in the example they set, that every person has worth, that love can overcome any obstacle, and that the opinions of narrow-minded people matter far less than the truth of your own heart. Ruby McKenna had started life as a girl with nothing, became a woman that society rejected, and ended as a beloved matriarch whose impact rippled through generations. Jack Thornton had been a wealthy rancher who could have chosen an easy path, but instead chose the harder road of fighting for love and defending the defenseless. Together, they had created something extraordinary. Not just a successful ranch or a thriving family, but a love story that proved kindness was stronger than cruelty, that character mattered more than circumstances, and that the human heart had an infinite capacity for growth and change. In the final accounting, the town gossips who had declared Ruby unworthy had been forgotten, their names lost to history, and their judgments revealed as empty and meaningless. But Jack and Ruby Thornton were remembered with love and admiration, their story retold as inspiration for anyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, weren't worthy, couldn't possibly achieve their dreams. Because they had proven that with courage and love and the willingness to fight for what mattered, anything was possible. Even a saloon girl and a cowboy could build a love that lasted beyond their lifetimes, touching hearts and changing minds for generations to come. And somewhere in the vast Texas sky, perhaps their spirits still danced together, two souls who had found each other against all odds and had held on tight through every storm, proving once and for all that love, real love, was the most powerful force in the universe. The end of their earthly journey was just the beginning of their legend, a legend that whispered to anyone who would listen. Don't let others define your worth. Fight for love. Believe in the impossible. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with someone brave enough to say, "You're wrong about her. She's too good for all of you." And sometimes, just sometimes, they're right.